In this episode, I'll be sharing my process of painting the Blood Stalkers for my wife's Daughters of Khaine army. This tutorial will serve two purposes. One, it will help anyone looking for inspiration on how to paint their own Daughters of Khaine army, and two, it will act as a reference for my wife as she proceeds to paint her own army. The color scheme of the models is derived from her explanation on how she would like her units to look, and my attempt to translate her description onto the models. Initially, I had primed the models in black, as I do for most of my models, and applied a zenithal highlight using white ink through my airbrush, before realizing that at no point would my dearest wife voluntarily use an airbrush. So I opted for using my preferred spray-on white primer instead. Before we begin painting, let's take a moment to gather the paints we will need, as well as prepare our paint station. If possible, I recommend having a dry palette available to use for the speed and contrast paints. Putting these paints in the wet palette can cause them to become too watery and reduce the amount of control you have over their consistency. I like to use these small paint wells for my speed and contrast paints. With everything prepped and ready, the first thing we'll tackle is the hair. The paints used for this were Holy White, Blood Red, and a little bit of Speedpaint Medium. You want to add these to your dry palette as you'll be working quickly between each color. You'll want to mix the Blood Red and the Speedpaint Medium in a 1:1 ratio. Because we'll be transitioning the hair from white to red, we'll be using a technique called wet blending. This is when you transition your colors while the paints are still wet. First, apply Holy White from the top to about halfway down the hair. Quickly rinse your brush and apply the Blood Red from the halfway point to the end of the hair. Rinse the brush again, dabbing off any excess water in a paper towel. Then, while both paints are still wet, blend the colors together to create a transition between white and red. The last step for the hair is to highlight the white portion with any white paint that you have. When highlighting the hair, you want to try to leave some of the Holy White in the recesses, focusing on the raised areas. This will add depth to the hair. Honestly, this is the hardest and most technical part of the mini, and if you can get through this, it's all downhill from here. Next, we work on the skin. We'll be using Guilliman flesh, thinning it down by mixing it with some contrast medium in a 1:1 ratio. Apply this to all the skin areas, trying not to get it on any of the scale or armor portions. You also want to make sure to prevent any overpooling in the recesses. With the skin complete, we move on to the tail. We're going to start with the scaly backside. I used Plasmatic bolts and applied this from the top to tip, avoiding the underbelly. If you accidentally paint into an unpainted area, you can always go back to the white on your palette to touch up any mistakes. When we're done with the Plasmatic bolt, we're going to add a layer of Drakenhof Nightshade. This wash is going to darken the color and add definition to the scales. For the underbelly, Becca wanted a stark contrast, so we'll be using Skeleton Horde from CITADEL. To finish the tail, we use black Templar on the scale ridge and the center of the tail. Be careful to not let the paint bleed onto the other tail portions. We use the same color on the bow to give it a dark black wood appearance. The quivered armor straps were painted using Wyldwood, and the arrows were done using Snakebite leather. Personally, I thought they'd look better in black, but these are her minis, I guess. The body armor and bow filigree were painted using Retributor armor, and then washed over with Army Painter soft tone. If you don't have that, Seraphim Sepia works just as great. This step is optional, and if you prefer a shinier armor, you can skip it. Her bracers, arrowheads, and filigree in the quiver were painted using plate mail metal, and then washed over with a thin coat of Gryph Charger Gray. I also used Gryph Charger Gray and applied it to the recesses of her eyes to give it a shadowy look. Then I dotted in her pupils using a little bit of pale saffron. For the base, I used Darkwood everywhere but the rocks. These I will cover in Gryph Charger Gray to give it a rocky appearance. Once the dark wood of the base is dry, I dry brushed a little bit of light brown on top to pick up some of the details. Afterwards, I added a couple of flower tufts just to add a little bit of variety and interest to the base. If the tufts that you're using are too large, you can always cut them up with an X-Acto knife into smaller tufts and then place them where you'd like. The last step is always to clean up the rim of your base. You can use any color you'd like for this, but I just think painting over it with black makes the model look really clean. Beck and I have recently started playing more Warhammer together, and it's been a ton of fun. There's something to be said when you see your armies on the table and you slowly start to add color and variety, and it all sort of comes together and begins to tell the story. I hope that this video was easy to follow. In my next video, we'll put it to the test as Becca attempts to execute the paint scheme. Guys, let me know what you thought of the video in the comments section below. I'm always really happy to look to the comment section and interact with you guys in any way that I can. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing. It does really mean a lot to me. And if you found the video useful or entertaining or enjoyable, give it a thumbs up. That's it for this video, and as always, stay messy.